a warm hello to all of you. I hope you enjoy today's session that will mainly be focused on how to read and summarize papers. Let me just move this window out of the way. Right. So let's look a bit at the learning objectives today. So today we'll be learning how to read papers and also how to summarize papers. For example, if we want to write a literature review or if we want to write the introduction of a paper. So these are the two components that we need to understand and learn today. And reading papers is a very, very important skill that one has to learn how to read effectively and how to effectively critique papers, because this will also be important one day when you become a reviewer. Then you need to understand how to effectively read and critique papers so that you can effectively provide a very robust review. So let us look at this first question. Why should we read papers? Now, it's very important for you when you start with your M or your D study, you start reading the literature right at the beginning, as we also mentioned in previous sessions. And as you go along with your studies, you should continue reading because papers get published all the time. And these papers are really the heart of the science community. This is what advises and builds our science. So it is extremely important to learn how to read papers quickly and also insightfully, because you can gain a lot of information from reading a paper. For example, the writing style. How do researchers write? What type of methods do they use? What type of statistical analysis do they use? How do they present their data? These are all clues that you can get from a paper that can advise you to write your work better. So let's look again at why we read papers. So remember, we have to read papers for several reasons. We may want to review a paper for a journal club or for a conference or for our supervisor. Most importantly, we want to keep current in the field. We want to know what is going on, what is being published, where are the gaps in the knowledge that my research can fill. Then also, if we want to write a literature review, or if we want to write a review paper to be published, or the introduction section of our papers, and also the discussion to advise our discussion section, it's important to do a good research overview by reading papers that have been published. And very important, read papers in high impact journals. So if you see a journal, type in the journal's name in Google, and then next to the journal's name, you type in impact factor of the journal, and then you can check what is the impact factor of this journal? What is the goal of the journal? Who is the readers? What is the citation metrics? Do the journal have social media profiles, etc.? So have a look at the type of material you read, because if you read a paper in a poor impact journal, it will not be good for your development. So go and read papers in Nature Scientific Reports or Nature Family Journals that is of high standing. And remember, if you are a researcher, you will spend hundreds of hours every year, every day, reading papers. So one needs to learn how to effectively read and summarize and what to look for in papers. This is an extremely important skill that you as a researcher have to learn. Now let's look at where do we read. Okay, so when we read or when we do a literature review, it's important to read journal papers. This is important. Textbooks you can also read, but sometimes the information in textbooks may be out of date depending on when the textbook was published. Right? Journals also provide the most accessible means of information that you may need. Okay, you can get a good explanation for your data and also enough details to replicate what you read about. Okay, also you can find out how certain research was done by looking at the methodology of a study. right? And you need to learn to read how to read these papers in journals, because one day you'll be writing a paper yourself. And this is extremely important in your career development, to already start publishing papers in your M&D studies. So don't wait, start publishing early. So, right, let's now move on to why we should read articles or papers in journals, right? We want to learn at the very early stage of our career how to do the research. We need to learn how to critically think about the quality of a paper. And remember, in any discipline, there can be mistakes and there's lasting ideas. So learn how to tell the difference. For example, if you look at the conclusion section, you can get ideas for future studies, because researchers may highlight the limitations of the current work, or they may also mention future work. So it helps you also provide, gain perspective of the types of research being done and where the gaps in knowledge are. Now, right, there's different types of research papers that are being published in journals. One gets the editorial that is normally written by the editor, or it can be, the editor can invite someone to write the editorial. Then you can get commentaries, or research notes that are relatively shorter papers. You won't get so much. Some of these articles may only be comment on an article that has been published in the journal. So when you look at journal papers, you should mainly focus on two types of papers. That is the review or the systematic review papers, and then your primary research articles. So if you want to gain knowledge about a certain field very quickly, go and look for review papers that have been recently published in a high impact journal, because this can summarize your field nicely and you can get a very broad overview of what is being done. And okay, so this also reviews also summarizes data and conclusions from many other studies. And then in comparison, your primary research paper will contain original data and conclusions, introduction, a method section, and you can also learn a great deal from reading those. Right, so let's look at this one. So how do we distinguish between what is a review paper and what is a primary research paper? So normally if you download a paper, if you look on top, right on top of the paper, it will be mentioned that this is a review paper, or the authors may also highlight in the abstract that in this review, we will address this and this and this. So this information will already be on the first page of an article, right? Reviews also don't have a method section, so there's no method section. In your review article, you may have graphs, you may have tables, you may have figures, but these are all sometimes retrieved from previous papers. But remember, very important, when you are writing a review yourself and you are including figures from articles that has already been published, one needs to get copyright clearance for using those material in your review paper. So you can contact the journal, you can ask them what is the process, you can explain to them that you want to use this figure and this specific article for your review that you aim to publish in this journal, and then you ask them what is the process for copyright clearance. So just a point for future to remember. And then also when you are looking at reviews, read different types of reviews from different authors eminent in the field. Right. Now, as we already mentioned, it's important to review, to read journals, book chapters. Information may be outdated, but you can still have a look at book chapters depending on the date that it has been published. Abstracts and proceedings may also provide you with information, dissertations and other internet sources, but the primary type of material that you want to read is peer review journals in high impact journals. Okay. Then also, as we mentioned before, when you read an article in a certain journal, Check the impact factor. What is the impact factor? This represents the average number of times all articles in a journal are cited during 1 year, right? Also remember that there's a lot of different citation metrics. We will discuss that in a different session, but just there's various factors that can influence this impact factor. So look at the journal standing. What is the content that it covers and the audience, and does it have a social media presence? Who's on the editorial board? From which universities are they? From which countries? Now remember, this impact factor can be influenced by small fields of studies, large number of journals in a field, or sometimes important work may not be cited. So just be cognizant of that. Now, when we read, we also need to understand that a journal article, and I'm referring now not to the review, but to the academic research paper that contains original research. So this type of paper will have your title, your authors, their affiliations, their contact details, keywords. They will have an abstract. They will have an introduction, there will be a materials and methods, there will be a results, a discussion, acknowledgement, and there will be references, and there will be figures and tables. Now, out of each of these blocks, one can get very useful information. So when you read it, think about what you read. First of all, the title. You can learn how to write effective titles by reading titles of articles published in good journals. When you also read the title, the paper, look at who's the authors. Where do they come from? Do they come from a high impact university? In which country? You can maybe collaborate with them. Also the keywords, look at what types of keywords these articles are using that you can use in your search strategy to look for literature. Look at how they summarize the abstract. Now, something very important about abstracts is not all the information in the paper may always be in the abstract. Sometimes authors leave out very important details in a study in the abstract. Okay, introduction, you read how you draft the introduction. Materials and methods and results, you can all gain very useful information out of this, but we will be discussing that a bit later in more detail. Right? So when we read these different sections, the general rule of thumb regarding what goes where when both reading and writing a scientific article is the following. So when we look at the title, it must be short. See if the title you are reading is short, succinct, and eye-catching. Now remember, there's a difference in how titles are written in academic papers that are published in journals and titles that are published of papers that appear in types of popular magazines like The Conversation. These titles will differ. A research title of an academic paper will be more professional, more related exactly describing what the article is about, its main findings perhaps, while the popular research article normally has your more interesting, more eye-catching, more, how can I say, type of title that attracts the readership of a broader audience of people outside of science. So remember this difference. The title of the paper that is published in an academic journal is different from the title of a paper that is published in a popular magazine like The Conversation. Remember, even when you read titles in journals, you need to see how is this written. How do the people or researchers compile their titles so that you can also learn how to compile effective titles. The abstract will tell you why the study was done and some of the main findings and conclusion of the research. When you look at the introduction, you will get an idea of when the study was done, who did it, why they did it, and how they did it, what they actually did. and where they did it. If they were doing an environmental or a medical study, they have maybe been sampling people or participants or samples from a specific location. So also look at that. The results, what data have been collected, and also how do researchers present it. Sometimes people will present results as tables, but remember, a figure is more eye-catching if you want to show trends in the data. Tables are more for perusing differences in the actual numbers, but if you want to show something visually, if there's a trend in a data set, you want to show a figure. This is also important for when you are presenting at conferences, to rather use figures, because people get bored if they see a lot of text on the slide with a lot of different numbers that some of them may not be able to make sense of, because sometimes you may attend multidisciplinary conferences and there's people from a whole lot of different disciplines, and then they may not exactly understand what you are doing, right? So keep that in mind. Then also very important, in some journals, the results and the discussion section are combined. So if you have now written up your paper, and then you are aiming to go to submit to a specific journal, check if this journal combines results and the discussion, and see how they write this, because this is a bit different than from a type of article that will have a separate results section where you will just report the results. You mention what you obtained, were there significant differences in the data, and you mention this. For example, if you analyzed if pears taste better, or you get more pears than apples, for example, then you say the study showed that there was significantly, and you give a p-value, more apples than pears, and then you describe the means or the descriptive statistics of that as well. Remember, if you have tables, you can just summarize the data in the table in the results section. You don't have to repeat the entire table. But see how this is done, because this works a bit differently. Then sometimes also the problem with this combined results and discussion sections are people don't really discuss the results. This is very important. When you provide a result, you have to discuss it. Many people just repeat the results in the discussion without really discussing what this result means, how does it compare with other literature, etc. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Now, when you're reading the paper, what should you take note of? As I already mentioned, take a look at the authors. Who are the authors? Are they part of an eminent research group? What is this research group doing? Are they only concentrating on one thing? Are they multidisciplinary? With whom do they collaborate? This is important for you, because these people can potentially be your collaborators, right? And then you can also know if these authors are publishing a lot of papers in this field, then you can look for their other papers in other journals. You can also look for their collaborators' papers, or use the references in their paper to get even further papers in the field. Then ask yourself, what is the paper all about? How did they approach the study? What was the methods they used? How did they evaluate the data? What type of statistical analysis did they do? How did they compare the data? Did they use only descriptive statistics such as mean and standard deviation and that sort of thing, confidence intervals, or did they combine it, which is very important also, with multivariate or secondary statistics where they look for group associations, correlations, and that kind of thing. Then also check the shortcomings of the study, because this can advise you on some of the research that you can do yourself to add to this body of knowledge. Then how do you read it? You need to find a quiet place. Some people like reading with some type of music. Sometimes this is a bit distracting for other people. So find a quiet place where you can really just focus on what you are reading, because sometimes you may be reading a very complicated paper and then you need some silence and some focus to read through this. Slow down, read it in your own time. Some people like reading papers on the laptop or the computer. Others like to print it out so that they can actually highlight and mark certain important points and maybe file these papers. Whereas other people want to create like a Google Doc where they keep all of the articles that they can also then share with their supervisor, right? So this is all about how to read. Now let's look at the first approach of how to read a paper. So there's different types of approaches. Now you don't have to follow this. This is just some guidance for you to start in how to read papers, but you can develop also your own technique that fits you, because one technique may not always fit all people. So right. So in this first approach, you will read a paper up to 3 times, right? So then when you go through the reading process, each pass will want to achieve a certain goal. So the first read, you will get a general idea. What is the paper about? What did people find? What is the conclusions? Then in the second reading phase, you will actually start to grasp the content. You will actually start understanding what is this really about. And then in the last pass, this may be more when you are a reviewer or you really want to use the study for your own work, then you start critiquing the paper, you start reading it in real depth, right? So let's look at the first pass. So this is when you read the paper the first time. So you quickly scan, you want to get a bird's eye view of what is the paper about. And then you can think about, okay, is this paper important for me, or is it not necessary to go to a second reading phase? This can take you about 5 to 10 minutes. And in this first reading phase, you will read the title, the abstract, and the introduction. Then you can read the sections and the subsections, and then you can immediately jump to the conclusions and maybe glance over some references. Maybe you'll find some that you already have or some that you can add. So this is the first pass. So at the end of this first reading phase, you should be able to answer some questions. What type of paper is this? Is it a review? Is it a research paper? Is it a systematic review? What analysis was being done in this type of paper, or did they produce some research prototype? What is this all about? What is the category of the paper? Then which other papers is it related to? Okay, which theoretical bases were used to analyze the problem? Right? Also, you need to think about correctness. Do the assumptions in this paper appear to be valid, or could they have been doing more methodological techniques or more data analysis to really achieve their aims? Is this sufficient? What is the paper's main contributions? To what field is it contributing? Is it well written? So, right. Then, using this information, you may choose either to read it or not to read it further. So in that first phase, you will now see, do you want to read further or do you not want to read further? Is this paper interesting to you, or you know already enough to skip the paper and go to another one, right? The first pass is adequate for papers that aren't in your research area but may someday be more relevant for you. Okay, take care to choose coherent sections and subsection titles. This can also advise you, for example, when you're reading a review, you can also get an idea of what types of titles or subheadings do people use to kind of group information together in a review. And then this can guide you on what type of headings you can use in your literature review, right? Very importantly, this is also the first pass read is also what a reviewer one day for your paper will be reading. He or she will be glancing at your abstract, and they may be looking very briefly at your conclusion. So make sure that these parts of the paper are well written. Okay? Right. Now we're going to the second phase of how to read your paper. Right? And now in this phase, you will be reading it in much more detail, right? Sometimes you can ignore certain details, but focus on the figures, for example. If people have included illustrations or figures, look at that, at the tables. Are the axes properly labeled? Are the results shown with error bars? And are the conclusions statistically significant? You can also see some common mistakes. Remember, not all published work may be correct depending on the standing or the impact of the journal. So that's why we said look out and read in high impact journals. Okay, you can also mark now some of the references that you don't have read yet that you want to use for further work. So this you all do in the second reading phase. Right? How long this may take may depend on you. It may take you up to an hour. Maybe you want to summarize certain information from the paper, and this level of detail is appropriate for a paper in which you are interested. So you are now interested in using this paper or gaining information from this. So you now start really looking into great detail about what the content of this paper is, how is the introduction written, what methods are they using, how do they summarize their results, what type of statistical analysis are they using, and also how do they discuss their result, right? Sometimes you won't really understand a paper after the second reading phase, so then you read it again. And you, for example, can first focus just on an introduction. You can read this several times, and then you can, after the introduction, you read the results and then the discussion. Or sometimes people will go straight to the methodology to see in this type of study approach, what types of methods that they use. Also, there may be certain terminologies and acronyms that you are not familiar with that you need to find out what does this type of word mean in this specific discipline, right? Then the authors may also use this or yourself to look at the types of experimental techniques that other authors use, as we already mentioned. Remember, sometimes papers may be very poorly written, and then you can start picking this up when you read the paper during the second phase. And then if it is poorly written, rather just accumulate the most important information and then move on to a different paper. Remember always, this is very, very important. Read papers in high impact journals and read papers when you are not tired. Then you have more energy to accumulate information and really read the work very critically, right? Now, after you've read the paper now for the second time, you can either choose now, shall we stop now? We didn't really understand the material, or this is not really related to me. You can again return to the paper later on, and then you can persevere and then read through it one last time. Sometimes one may also forget what you have read, and then you have to start again. And remember, this third phase of reading is very important because if you are a reviewer, you need to read a paper at least 3 times to really understand the content and start critiquing certain things or points in the paper, right? So you want to now start really understanding, and this third reading phase is to attempt you to really virtually re-implement this paper. So you are going to make certain assumptions. And if you want to, you now can also recreate this work by looking at, for example, the limitations in the study and how you can build on this, right? Or if they suggest future work, then you can build on this, right? So have a look at this. This third phase is just really where you give a lot of attention to the content of the paper. You start basically critiquing now the content in very depth and in a lot of detail, right? This comparison of the actual with the virtual lends a very sharp insight into the proof and presentation techniques. Remember, also when you're looking at the methods, look in detail what the methods are that they used. Look at the limitations of these methods. Could another method or another analytical technique have been used? Could A multidisciplinary approach have been used by combining different techniques from different fields. So this you will now start to think. This phase is where you start to actually think about the paper, right? Now, this last pass can take some time, right? For more experienced senior people, it can take just about an hour. And it also depends on whether you are familiar with the field or not. So at the end of this third reading phase, you should be able to reconstruct the entire structure of the paper from memory. So now you know the paper and you can really start critiquing it. Okay, and in particular, you should be able to pinpoint implicit assumptions, missing citations maybe. Should they have added this reference? Why didn't they add this reference? Potential issues also with the experimental and the analytical technique. So in this third phase, you really start critiquing now the paper. Is the aims good enough? Is the methods good that they used? Could they have discussed it better, etc. So just to summarize, first phase reading, or the first approach to reading, is where you go through the 3 phases. The first phase, you just briefly scan through the paper, you read the abstract and maybe the conclusions. Then the second phase, where you will be looking in more detail to the figures, for example, the methods that they used. And the third phase will really be about really critiquing now this paper. Could they have used another method? Is the introduction well written? Did they cite the most important and relevant literature in this field? Also, you need to start looking at did they well discuss the paper? Did they conclude? Because remember, sometimes people, when they write conclusions, they will just mention, they will just summarize the discussion. They won't really conclude what are the implications of this study, what is its limitations, and what is the future work. And if you read studies in very high impact journals, you can learn a lot from this last phase by seeing how people summarize figures, how do they analyze their data, and how they really discuss and conclude their data. Okay, so this is now another type of approach that you can use. You don't have to follow this. You have to kind of develop your own style. Remember what I said initially before I started with these different approaches. So let's now look at the second type of approach that people use. Sometimes they will just look at the body of the paper, the major headings. For example, if you're working with a review paper, then they will scan the headings. What is this all about? What headings are people using to outline or summarize this whole topic? And these headings then you can also use for yourself in your literature review to guide the reader to why you did the study. Then also ask yourself, how many figures are the authors using? Because this is also important when you're compiling a paper. You should go and read. If you decided on a journal that you're going to submit the paper to, you need to decide already now, how many figures am I going to put in? Because certain journals only allow a certain amount of figures and tables to be put in a paper. Then what kinds of figures do they generally include? Do they include gels? For example, if you analyze DNA, will they include a gel of the DNA? Sometimes this is not really relevant, so some people won't include this. What type of graphs do they include? If they include microscopic images, how do they represent it? It's important to remember when you are presenting an electron micrograph image or a light microscope image, you need to include the scale bar that shows the size of the things you are showing in this image. So these are all things one needs to think about. Then what is the conclusion of the paper? So this is when you're skimming through the paper in the second approach, right? Then you will go and have a look at the vocabulary that is used in this paper. Sometimes if it's a new discipline or not really related to your field, but there still might be useful information for you, there may be some words or keywords that you do not understand, and then you need to go and look up. What does these words mean? what are they related to, and what do they really explain? Sometimes you can also use these words then as keywords to search for literature, right? But remember, if you don't understand something, you need to go and ask someone or Google it so that you can get a good comprehension of the paper. Okay, you can go and look at biology textbooks, online dictionaries, etc. You can ask your supervisor. And remember, important phrases that are part of a major concept and are bigger than just vocabulary, such as risk reduction, you will come back to them in context while reading for comprehension, right? So you really need to understand what does this word mean so that you can really understand what is this paper about, okay? So remember, there's a difference between certain words you don't understand and certain phrases, okay? Right. Now, we're going to look, now we're done with how to read the paper. Now we're going to look into a bit more detail about what you need to look for in the paper. So when you look at the abstract, you will start understanding how is abstract written up and what is the style of writing up an abstract. Does it have headings like background, methods, results and conclusion, or is it unstructured? It's just a typical paragraph. How long is it? What is the word count? This can also guide you now when you start writing your own work, if you want to publish it, how long your abstract should be. And this is also defined in the notes to the authors of a journal. They will mention to you that you can only write or submit abstracts or include abstracts in a paper that is, for example, 250 or 300 words. You will want to look in the abstract also, what is the purpose of the study? What is the major findings? What was the relationship between the data as well? And sometimes PubMed searches, certain search engines will summarize the abstract. So you will see the title and the abstract, and then you can see, okay, this paper may be interesting for me, maybe not. But remember, very importantly, sometimes people leave out important information in the abstract. There's many instances or cases where authors didn't include all the information in the abstract that they did in the article itself. For example, they may leave out the method that they used, or they may not discuss all the data. Okay, so remember this is important. Now you look at the title and the authors. So remember, the title should be descriptive. And remember what we mentioned earlier, there's a difference between a title for an academic paper and a title for a more popular paper. So also look at, when you're reading good journals, how are titles written? How do researchers really phrase titles? Sometimes journals would also not like two-part titles, or they will prefer that you write a title that summarizes the actual data that you obtained, or the actual results of the paper, or the implications of the paper. Some others would like you to more provide a general title about describing what the work is about. Like, for example, if you did work in, for example, the effect of a microbe on plant growth, then the title would be something in the line of effect of this yeast on growth physiology and photosynthetic parameters of, for example, this plant. Then also remember, when you read the title, see if it really reflects the content of the paper, because sometimes people may include very vague titles or vague wording that is not very clear. For example, in medical studies also, you need to include, for example, where you did the study. If you did, for example, a clinical trial, or for example, if you work in a toxicology field, you need to include where you sampled the material from. For example, if you did a toxicological study in miners, you need to include, for example, elemental analysis of hair to determine exposure to heavy metals in a population of miners from Sudan, something like this. Then also the order of the authors important is, look at this. Very importantly, where are they coming from? What are their affiliations? Are they coming from a group of standing? Now, normally, before you even start reading the introduction, you need to take notes. Get yourself a piece of pen and paper, or sometimes you can make notes on the article itself if you have a PDF program that allows this. So you really want to draw types of notes for yourself, summarizing some important, for example, vocabulary, the takeaway message of the paper. Then you need to start answering certain questions before even you read. What do you want to get out of the introduction? By reading the introduction, you will understand what is the state of knowledge in this field. What data led to the work of this paper? What is the hypothesis being tested, and what are the basic conclusions? Okay, sometimes scientists, it depends really on the journal and the authors, but sometimes they like the punchline right at the beginning, right already in the introduction. Okay, and remember also, sometimes you will get researchers that introduce new concepts in the discussion. Watch out for that. The discussion should link with the introduction and methods and the results. So look also when you read if there's coherency in this paper, whether the authors give a good introduction and whether they really discuss the results. Okay. You can really, if the paper is not really relevant for you, you can just skim through the introduction. Then some people focus more on the results and discussion, whereas others focus more on the methods, just to give them ideas of what kind of methods is being used. Now make notes for yourself, or you can also, after you downloaded a series of papers, you can also group them together by categories. For example, these ones you are interested in the methods that you want to use. These ones are, for example, you're going to use the introduction to guide your introduction of your paper. And for example, then you group the lot together from which there is useful information for your discussion, and make notes along the way, and make sure also you back up the information. Now, once you're done with the introduction, you will get, in the introduction, remember, you will get an overview of what the study was about, why did they did it, and how they did it. Sometimes people already introduce a summary of the methods in the introduction. So this will basically introduce the subject to you. So look at how this is written. The flow of information. Normally, some people will start with a broad background by mentioning broad epidemiological data, for example, or brief background about the topic, and then they will narrow it down towards the aims. They will, for example, mention what research has been done, what is the gaps in this, and then to motivate why you did the study and how you contributed to the limitations of previous studies. Then when we focus now on the materials and methods, okay, you will want to see how did people approach the study? What was the design of the study? For example, if they did ecological study, for example, you now want to check how do they describe the study region where they sampled the samples from, for example. How do they describe the geographical region? Do they include a map? For example, do they include details about the climate and other factors in the specific region? How do they write certain parts of the methods? Also, what type of techniques did they use? Could they have used other techniques? What are the pros and cons of this technique for a specific sample? Because remember, techniques are very sample dependent. One technique for one sample may not be necessarily good for another sample. So read up about these techniques. Then when you read, okay, these people used, for example, PCR, or this one used HPLC, then it's also a good opportunity for you to start learning, okay, this is what people commonly use in my field, so I need to go and learn and attend workshops of how these techniques works. Because if you understand a technique, you will be able to more easily write this up and present this one day when you're doing your defense, right? So this is very important. Sometimes it's also good when you are summarizing the results, your supervisor may ask you, okay, summarize these results for me. And then you will want to summarize the methods. And this will also a good opportunity to get advice from your supervisor and critique about the certain method and how you can improve on that. Right now, when you read papers, it's important to get detail from this. What was, for example, the volumes of the concentrations or solutions that people used? What was the reaction times? Where did they purchase certain materials from? Did they, for example, order chemicals from Sigma? Were these chemicals analytical grade, purity? Have a look at this. You will notice in some, for example, if you're in the nano field, sometimes these papers lack detailed description of the exact concentrations or reaction times that was used. So check for papers in high impact journals that will normally provide a bit more detailed information. Not always, but in some instances they may do this. Also look at where they purchased equipment or consumables from. This may also guide you. So, for example, if you're working with a rare and very expensive chemical, then you can check whether this company is in our country and you can order it from here as well. So look at that. This is very important that you understand the method. Sometimes if a method is already known, the researcher may only provide a reference to this method that has already been published, and then you can go and have a look at that methods section in the already published paper. So some people may skim over the materials, some people may go into more detail. It depends all on your study field and how familiar you are with your specific study field. Do you know the type of methods used, or don't you know this? And if you don't know, then you need to read materials in methods in a bit more detail. For example, even when you look at the results, you will need to check, go back to the methods and check what was the sample number that these researchers used. Is this sufficient to reach statistical significance? Sometimes when you start a study, you will also need to do what they call a power analysis, but you need to speak to a statistician about this. And this is really to achieve a sample size that will give you statistical significance. You need to remember that sometimes if you use a too small sample size, the reviewers may critique you on this. But however, for some types of techniques, you cannot use a lot of samples because the technique itself takes very long, it may be very expensive, etc., etc. Look at also the conditions. For example, if you're in biochemistry, that these researchers use a reduced or a non-reduced protein gel. Now that you critically looked at the methods, you'll move on to the results, right? Now remember, the intro poses all the questions and the results then describes the outcome. So the intro and the methods and the results need to form a coherent coherency. There needs to be some coherency between the three. Did you achieve all of your aims? What you written in the results or what these researchers have mentioned in their results, does it link back to the aims of the study, and does it link back to all of the techniques that they used? Also, some people may not. They may mention in a methodology that they use the certain techniques, and then they may forget even to discuss this in a thesis. This is sometimes very common in master's thesis, where students use a certain technique, or they say in the introduction that they will do this and this and this, but then they forget to report on this in the results section. So make sure these three parts of your paper one day, or what you are reading in a journal article, makes sense. Does the results cover all of the aims and the objectives of the study? And is the methods that they use, do this support the actual outcomes? Okay. Remember, in the results section, look at how this researcher that has published this journal in a very high impact journal, how do they report on this? How do they report on p-values? How do they summarize the results? How do they reference figures and tables? How do they summarize the data in figures in tables? How do they compile legends for the figure and the table? This can also guide you to write good figure tables and legends and summarize data in good figures and tables. And remember, the figure and the table, sometimes you will get in poor impact papers, people that include a table with only one row. It's not really necessary to include such a table because it has only one row. So ideally, you need to check this. How do people report? Because if people report a table with only one row, this is not really good, because this could have also been summarized just as a result in the text. So look out for this. Then you can already see, no, this is not a very good paper. Let me just get the main punchline of this paper and move on to something else in a higher impact journal. Now, when you read the results, you should ask yourself once again, what was the aim of the study, the question being sought? Do you report all of the data that you obtained with all of the methods that you used? You can read it straight through it, or you can just scan it through. And then remember what we mentioned in the third phase of reading, you will more critically look at the figures and the tables and how it is summarized and presented and written. This is very important. If you're unfamiliar with methods, you can, as I already said before, attend workshops that you can learn what is this method about. One day, maybe you can do it yourself. This is very important. So go to workshops, learn, guide yourself. Now, after you've done with the discussion, you will go, after you've done with the results, you will go to the discussion. Then you read, how do people discuss the results? By reading this, you learn now how to really discuss a result, not just rehash, we found this and this and this. You really need now to discuss it. You need to compare it with the literature. Does it support it? Does it not support it? And why doesn't it support it? Did you use a bigger sample size, a smaller sample size? Did you use different parameters, maybe a different technique? That is why maybe the results are not exactly the same. Maybe you retrieved samples from a different area. So you need to all discuss these important points. Also look at the conclusion, right? Does this link back to the introduction? How they try to achieve their aims with the methods they used, and also how they reported the results. Does it all form a coherent work piece? Then you can think for yourself, describe for yourself why these data are, why do you think it could be significant? Could these authors have used different references, or maybe you might be aware of a different reference that they could have used? If you are a reviewer, then you mention this in your reviewer report. You really need to start understanding that if you read high impact journals, these authors normally really well discuss a discussion section. So read how they discuss this. Very, very, very important. This will also, after you've read the discussion, you will just get an overall picture of why does this work matter, right? And also the authors may they may include information on what was the limitations of the study, and then you can try and address the limitations of that study with your own work, right? Then also very importantly, when you read a discussion section, you don't always have to agree what the authors mention. Sometimes there's a lot of mistakes in publications. There could be maybe a different explanation for what they've achieved. Maybe they did not mention this. And maybe you can add this. If you are a reviewer, you can mention this in your review report, or you can also use this. You can jot down for yourself that this authors didn't discuss this in this manner, and now I can do this. I can add to some limitations they didn't mention or they didn't analyze in their study, and then I can contribute to that. Okay. Now in the acknowledgements also, this is not a very important section, but you can just read about how do people really thank other people, who do they thank. For example, some authors will include statisticians as co-authors. Some others may just thank the people that contributed to the work. Also have a look at how they report the funding that they receive. Note how they include the grant number and how they write the text. Okay, so have a look at that also. That can also guide you on what to report there. Some journals may also guide you on how to write the acknowledgement section and what you should include and who you should acknowledge. For example, you can some people will acknowledge their cat. This is not allowed in academic publishing, or their family. So this is just really very professionally people that contributed to the work, like technical assistants or statisticians or someone like this. So have a look at that so that you can also try and get a feel for who is acknowledged in a paper. Now, if we look at references, this is also an important section because in the reference section, you may find also other useful papers that you need to go and read, or papers that the collaborators of these authors are doing work in. So have a look at that. Also, you may find some very useful information in these papers. And then also, if you haven't published any papers yet, normally references will appear in introduction, materials and methods and discussion. Sometimes in results, but not often. So a results section will normally not have references. Then sometimes when you are looking at a lot of papers, you need to dedicate some time to look at these sections, like what we discussed now, the abstract, the introduction, in a lot of detail, but sometimes there may not be time. So you need to look at which are the most important papers for you, which are the ones that you need to provide more energy and more time to. So have a look at that. What group the papers together, for example, that you can just skim over, and the others that you need to go into a bit more detail, right? If you struggle with a paper, don't worry about it. You can just use a highlighter. You want to outline, underline certain text. You may want to go back to this. If there's certain words you don't understand, mark this, go to the internet or your supervisor and try and understand what this terminology means. And you have to reread and reread some sections until you completely understand it. And don't highlight, when you highlight information in a paper, don't highlight the whole text, just most important facts in the paper that is relevant to you that you can use for your own work. Then sometimes people will want to make notes, as we already mentioned. You want to, for example, you will want to make a list of all the papers you have, for example, in an Excel document. And then you may mention in the Excel document, for example, this one I will use for my introduction. Then this paper I may use for my methods. This one I may use for my discussion. This one maybe has useful reference in it. So record what you have read also. Once you read a paper, you can summarize it in a separate piece of paper or on your computer. Then you can quickly summarize it so that you can, it's more easily then later on when you forget what you've written, then you can just go to the summary that summarizes what you read in this paper, what is the take-away message of this paper. Right, so sometimes you can summarize only certain things, like for example, from the introduction, you can summarize the aims of this paper and the gaps in knowledge, and then also from the methods, you can summarize, for example, people in my field use this sample size, they look at this, for example, participant characteristics, for example, they what is the exclusion and inclusion criteria, for example, if they select participants for a certain study in a certain field? What are those exclusion characteristics that they are using? For example, if you're doing a study on cancer, On the factors that contribute to cancer in patients, you may want to exclude people who are smoking or who are exposed to toxins, because then you may get confounding factors in the study that may contribute to the cancer, for example, other than genetic and diet factors. You want to summarize, for example, the instruments people use. You need to ask yourself, am I familiar with this technique? Do I need to attend a workshop? For this technique, you want to ask yourself, is this technique here in South Africa or is it abroad? Then you need to think about, I need to get funding to go overseas to do this technique. Then you need to understand this technique may not always be available. You need to have to book it. So you need to think about all these things. Then also look at the design. For example, in medical studies, you get a lot of different designs. You get retrospective reviews, you get clinical studies, you get longitudinal studies. There's a lot of different designs. You need to understand what those designs entail and how it will link up or how it can complement your own work. Maybe you will have the same study design. For example, if you are doing an experimental work and you are treating a sample with a certain chemical or a certain, for example, nanoparticle, you need to understand the method. So you summarize the method for yourself. How is samples treated? For how long are they treated? Under which conditions are they treated? In the oven, on the bench, or using a specified equipment? All these type of things you can summarize for yourself. And then when you have a broad summary from all of these papers, you can get a clue or an idea of what is valid in your field. Because remember, if you don't use valid methodology, the reviewers and your examiners may come back to you and tell you, but you didn't read the papers correctly, you didn't read the literature, your methodology is not right. People are using other techniques or other types of equipments or other treatment of their sample. Why didn't you use this? So check this in and jot down this when you read the paper. Then, very importantly, while you're summarizing the papers, you can already start summarizing the references that you're going to use in your own work or your own papers or your own thesis by already using bibliographic tools such as RefWorks and EndNote. And this makes it easier for you to summarize the content of a paper. There's some other as well for different types of, if you're, for example, using a systematic review, there's some other software that you can use for bibliographics. Now, by now, you may be tired because you've read such a lot of papers and there's such a lot of information in this. Don't stress, just relax a bit, take a bit of rest, and then you can go back to the paper. Remember what we talked about, the first reading phase, the second reading phase, and the third reading phase. You can do that in one run. Or, for example, in 1 week, you can just scan through a bunch of papers. In the second week, you can go through them in a bit more detail. In the third week, you really start thinking about the papers, you start critiquing them, and you start summarizing them. So this you can do how it fits you. If you want to do the 3-phase read in one run, you do that. But if you are tired, you have to stop. Because if you're tired, you don't accumulate that much information so effectively. Okay, now a very important phase for after you very critically read all of these papers, you've very critically had a look at all the introduction and the methods, what people use, how they report the results, etc. You need to start thinking really critically about the study. For example, if you're reading a study, imagine yourself, you being the examiner or you being the reviewer. Do you agree with how the author's rationale for setting up the experiments? Is this correct? Based on the other papers you read, could they have rather done this? Right? So now you need to start critically thinking. This is also for you also to improve your own work, because not everything you will read that is published will be good. That's why I always say go and read the papers in high impact journals. Avoid these predatory journals or low impact stuff where the studies may not be very robust and the information not very good, also not the writing very good in these papers. Ask yourself also, now you're critiquing this, you're really getting into this paper, you really want to see what is this, how can I improve it, how can I use it for myself? Did they perform the experiments appropriately? For example, did they have the correct sample number? What control groups did they use? Was the control correct? And also very important, sometimes people will use a positive both and a negative control. So they will have a test sample, and then they'll have a positive and a negative control, or just a negative control. So have a look at this, what types of control they use. Also, for example, in psychological studies, if people test participants with types of what they call if they, for example, look at the cognition of a patient that has been using drugs, they will be, for example, using a neurocognitive test battery, what they call. This is just a questionnaire, basically. But you have to ask yourself then, has this questionnaire been tested for reliability and validity in that specific population? So these are the types of questions you need to start thinking now. Now comes in the thinking phase of what you read, the critiquing phase. Also, what we mentioned before, did they do enough experiments? Could they have done more? Could they have combined different experiments? For example, if they did an elemental analysis, did they only use ICP-MS? Was the ICP-MS appropriate for the sample they used? For example, in certain elemental analytical techniques, you have to destroy the sample, and then you can introduce contaminants. So could you have complemented this specific technique with, for example, if you use ICP, could you have also used AAS, or atomic absorption spectroscopy, that may be even more specific for certain types of elements in your sample? So could they have used combination of different techniques? Then look at the patterns in the data and how they present it. Do you agree with their conclusions? What types of other questions can you get out of this data or out of this paper? How can this advise your future work? Now you have to think, okay, they did all of this, so what can I do? Sometimes people may not always mention this is the limitation of the study and this is future work. Sometimes this will not be mentioned, but you can already start thinking, they didn't do this, so maybe I can add to this or have a different angle, or they didn't use this approach, now I can use this. But make sure the approach and the study that you do is really novel and it will make a contribution to the field. Now you want to start to talk also, once you critique the paper yourself and you've written down all your comments and suggestions, you want to start talking to your supervisor, and you want to talk, maybe you want to present this in a journal club. You want to check maybe online talks or links to other references of this paper, and you want to go and listen to this. But essentially, you now need to go and discuss this with other people. That's why sometimes it's good when labs have journal clubs, so that researchers can discuss journal papers, because how you look at it and how someone else looks at it may be different, and you can get a lot of insight by discussing one thing with a group of different people, having a different mindset, or maybe that may be more senior than you, maybe have more insight in this field. So discuss the paper. Don't sit there and stress and you think, oh, I don't understand this. This is perfectly normal. If you don't understand, you ask. You remember what we said, we're going into a question and asking mode. Once we really accumulated the information presented in the paper, we start critiquing, we start asking questions, we're reviewing this paper, we're thinking that we are the examiner, we are the reviewer. How can we really critique and improve on this work? And remember, just because it's published, it doesn't mean it's right. That's why, again, read papers in high impact journals, good impact journals. So in some, let's look at this. You can use this template to kind of summarize what you've read. You can summarize, you can include the website address, you can include the authors, the title, the journal, the website that you retrieved it from, the keywords that are being summarized in the paper. What is the general subject area? Could it be linked to other subject areas? What was the hypothesis and the aims and the objectives of the study? Then you can list briefly how the methodology was done, what was the design of the study, the sample size, and the specific methods or techniques that they used, and how they treated sample, for example. What was if you're working with individuals, you're doing a medical study, what was the inclusion and exclusion criteria? Why was these patients excluded? Should they have been included, etc.? Then you summarize the main results of the paper, the key points, what is the takeaway message, what is the significance of the field, how do they add to the body of knowledge. Maybe they use interesting figures, or maybe they use interesting statistics that you can follow up on. So summarize all of this. Then if we just look at the broad overview of how you approach reading and summarizing papers, remember you plan. First, you have a planning phase. You will set the goals. What is the goals of reading this paper? What do you need to get out of it? Then you start reading. You go through the different reading phases. First you scan, then you go into a bit more depth, and then you really start thinking about the paper. And then the last phase, you start critiquing it. You start thinking very critically and very creative about this specific paper. Remember, we said we must look at the title of a paper, the authors, where do they come from. We can just briefly get an overview of the paper in the abstract, but remember, not everything is always summarized in the abstract. We look at the introduction to also see how people or researchers in high impact journals approach writing an introduction to effectively introduce why they did the study, that leads to the aims and objectives of the study, also the methods that they used, how they discuss it, how they present data. You can also look at the types of figures. Sometimes people will also include very interesting graphs and figures summarizing certain information. Sometimes you can also think, okay, could this have been one graph, or is it right that they presented this as two graphs? Also, sometimes it's important to look at, for example, this one. If you look at this figure, if you want to critique this, did they mention in the legend here that the image here on the left describes this and the image on the right describes this? Do they clearly explain everything what is going on in this figure here, and how do they explain it? So have a look at this, also at the main conclusions of the study. This can also give you great advice for your own studies on where the gaps in knowledge are. So again, just another summary. So when you are also looking at papers and one day writing your own papers, just before you submit it, you will want to summarize your key findings. Check the paper, what are the key findings? You will want to identify, when you look at the paper that has already been published, or once you're writing your own paper, you want to identify patterns and relationships among your data. Could you present it differently? How did people before you summarize these patterns and relationships between data? Okay. Also think about when you read a paper that has already been published, or also when you're writing your own paper one day, does the results meet the expectations and aims of the study? Remember also to think that the introduction and the methods and results and discussion need to form a coherent piece. One leads to the other. Okay, do you contextualize your findings within previous research? That means, do you discuss your findings? What does it mean? What does it mean? Do you compare your results? Why did it support previous studies? Why didn't it support previous studies? Because you did maybe a different technique, or maybe you use a different sample size or a different population. These are all things you need to think about. Do you explain unexpected results? Don't only compare with the literature. Explain. Also check whether this author is there some unexplained results, something very unexpected. Does this person really explain this? Okay, that's very important. Could there be also an alternative explanation for when someone has explained something in already published work? Do they discuss the implications? This is also important for you when you write your paper one day. You can also start learning now, how do people write implications of studies that are published in good journals? How do they describe this? This can also guide you into really discussing what is the implications of your study one day. Do they acknowledge the limitations of this study? This you can also use to guide yourself when you're writing the limitations of your own study. Then you can also recommend future research. Also check how other people recommend their future research in already published literature. So these things you need to think about when you're reading a paper, and also when you are one day writing your own paper. So this phase of reading gives you an overview of how you should write a paper and what people write in papers, and read it in very, very high impact papers. Okay, you need to spend a lot of time on writing papers, on reading papers. This is very important, and you need to keep on reading papers because there might be a study that is similar to your work that has been published today. And if you miss out on this and some other reviewer of your work will see this, they will tell you, why didn't you cite this paper, right? Remember what we mentioned, if you're unsure about something, you look it up, you Google it, or you speak to your supervisor. If there's a certain terminology or a technique or a statistical technique you don't understand, go and speak with your supervisor. Sometimes discovering the stuff for yourself is the best way also to learn. Okay, because sometimes supervisors may not have sufficient time, or they may not be familiar with something. So if you can learn it yourself, remember also if there's workshops that you can attend, for example, on a technique that you want to use, do that. Right. Also, when you read a paper, summarize it in such a way as though you're going to present it, because obviously you're going to need to discuss the stuff that you read with your supervisor or your peers if you're attending a journal club. Then you can also, some people also start a database of procedures that you take the time to look up and teach yourself. As we already mentioned, for example, if you're not familiar with certain techniques like how to do apoptosis assays, you may want to visit a lab maybe that is specializing in this, and then you want to go there. Then you can make maybe a list of techniques that you read about and you're not familiar with, you need to use in your own study, that you need to learn. Make a list of that, go for training. Then watch others in your lab experience and find out what they are doing. Okay, that we already discussed. Remember, read papers that are relevant to your work. Sometimes, in some instances, also read unrelated papers, because you just might find some very, very useful information in there. And do this when you have energy. Take a break. If you struggle, leave the paper and go back to it after a certain time, or go and ask your supervisor for advice, right? And then if you need to provide a summary, for example, for a journal club or to your supervisor, you need to, you can use parts or sections of your summary, or you can also present the entire paper, and you want to read the paper and try to understand the main idea and the real take-home message of this. And sometimes you also need to present details, for example, the methods that was used, what types of data was obtained and how they presented this, what was the whole conclusion about this. And then when you present this to your supervisors or your peers, this can create to a different discussion. Other people may see different things or different outcomes of this paper that you may not have necessarily seen. For example, if you have, if you're working in a new field, you may not be so familiar with this. It's very important to present this data to more senior people or more people knowledgeable in this field. If you have, for example, a mentor in this field, then you can have a chat with them so that they can also go through the paper, and then they can advise you and tell you, okay, this is not a good paper, or this is a good paper, and they can tell you, okay, use this and this technique, and they can also then guide you on how to improve your work, your own work based on the specific paper, right? So we already covered some of that. Now, before we end off the session, I want you to have a look at this image here, right? So if you look at it quickly, you see a duck, right? But if you look at this for a long time and you really look at it from different angles, it almost looks like there's a rabbit in the image. Now, this is the same with reading papers. When you first skim through it, you'll just get bits and parts of the paper. But when you really start going into depth into a paper and thinking about this, could this have been done better? How can you use it for yourself? Then you get a different perspective of paper. So remember what we mentioned. Critically look at papers, read it carefully and use it to guide you. You can get a lot of information by reading papers. You can learn how to write. You can learn how different methods are used to answer a specific question, what statistical techniques are being used, and also how people discuss a certain result that they obtain. And this is something that young researchers and even senior researchers really struggle with, is discussing results. Some people may just rehearse results, especially if you have journals that combine results and discussion sections, and then reviewers may reject a paper or you may get a lot of critique from examiners. So learn the skill about how to read papers, how to summarize it, and how to very critically look at the content that can really guide you in your future work. There's some additional references that you can have a look at. So thank you very much for your attention. Good luck with this. And remember, reading papers in high impact journals is extremely important. So thank you very much.